Chapter 5, Substance Use Disorders Among Deaf Offenders, Dr. Guthmann and Dr. Kolvitz. Chapter Summary. Dr. Debra Guthmann is one of the editors of this publication and co-authored this chapter with Dr. Marcia Kolvitz. Dr. Guthmann has worked within the deaf community for over 40 years in educational, secondary, and post-secondary, medical and social service settings. Dr. Guthmann was the founding director of the Minnesota Substance Abuse Disorder Program for Deaf and Hard of Hearing Individuals, which opened in 1989, and was one of the first inpatient treatment programs for deaf and hard of hearing individuals in the country. Dr. Guthmann is currently the lead consultant for a federal grant with Wright State University, focusing on the validation of mental health, substance abuse, and career-related screening tools in American Sign Language. Dr. Kolvitz is a consultant who focuses on issues related to education, vocational rehabilitation, and transition services. She has over 40 years of experience addressing education and access issues for students who are deaf and hard of hearing in K-12 programs and post-secondary educational settings. Dr. Guthmann and Dr. Kolvitz are both past presidents of ADARA. In Chapter 6, Substance Use Disorders Among Deaf Offenders, Dr. Guthmann and Dr. Kolvitz discuss the intersection of substance abuse, mental health, and criminal behavior among deaf people. They address the presence of co-occurring disorders related to deaf offenders who have substance abuse issues. Throughout the chapter, the experiences of two deaf men are included to give the reader insight into the life experiences of deaf offenders with substance abuse and mental health issues. Guthmann and Kolvitz began the chapter by discussing the prevalence of substance use and criminal activity within the hearing community. The current estimates of substance use and addiction among the U.S. inmate population suggest that approximately 2/3 of them meet medical criteria for an alcohol or other drug use disorder. Unfortunately, there has been little research to date about the prevalence among inmates who are deaf. The authors include an overview of some of the literature that has been published focusing on substance use and criminal activity within the deaf community. This literature review also includes the discussion of several small prison studies involving deaf inmates, a recently completed prevalence study regarding substance abuse with deaf individuals, information about users, and a follow-up study that was completed by those who had gone through treatment. This chapter highlights the need for research in these areas. Although there is little prevalence data targeting deaf individuals, some research have estimated that substance abuse is at least as prevalent as it is among hearing individuals, which is usually estimated to be 8 to 10% of the general population. Dr. Guthmann and Dr. Kolvitz discuss how deaf offenders face a number of barriers to communication and other kinds of access throughout the criminal justice system. They highlight the need for providing effective communication access, whether through ASL interpreters, video phones, video relay services, printed materials, visual notifications, or TTYs, to assess deaf individuals better understand the judicial process, as well as the rules and procedures that typically occur in correctional facilities. The authors discuss the gaps in state and federal prisons that exist between available addiction treatment, inmate participation, and the need for such services. For many inmates, social isolation can also be a significant concern. Guthmann and Kolvitz share anecdotal stories from deaf inmates who are in facilities where they are housed with other deaf inmates, an example from those who may be the only deaf individual in their facility. Although prisoners may be required to participate in a program as part of a sentence, deaf individuals may be unable to access prison programming, such as religious services, educational classes, substance abuse treatment, and 12-step programs. Without an interpreter or other support services, a deaf inmate cannot participate in those programs and may be released much later than if an interpreter or other assistance was provided. Without appropriate access and service provisions, deaf individuals will continue to be incarcerated with ongoing recidivism and no opportunity to become contributing members of their community. Further exacerbating the problem is that currently there are no evidence-based treatment programs specifically designed for deaf individuals, whether incarcerated or not. The lack of treatment options for deaf individuals who may be required to participate in treatment in terms of their release is problematic, since there are no accessible options available in the community. This chapter also addresses situations where deaf prisoner rights have been violated. Several examples were described, including the landmark case of Joseph Hurd, a man who was deaf and mentally ill, who was unlawfully detained, denied communication access, and treated without being given informed consent. A somewhat hidden group within the deaf community are those individuals who may have mental illness, learning disabilities, attention deficit disorder, or cognitive disabilities, which have been linked to increased rates of substance abuse within the general population. The authors discuss the importance of conducting appropriate assessments and providing accurate diagnoses to identify and understand hidden disabilities among deaf individuals, including those who are incarcerated. Guthmann and Kolvitz note that there is insufficient training provided for law enforcement officers and prison staff regarding communication with deaf individuals. The authors express their concern that a lack of understanding and training among prison staff about communication and cultural barriers might have a negative impact on deaf individuals who are incarcerated. This chapter describes several resources that may be helpful when working with deaf offenders. These resources include steps in planning a parole package, as well as community resources such as vocational rehabilitation, adult basic education programming, and centers for independent living. The authors indicate that without accessible treatment and screening tools, it is not possible to accurately identify deaf persons who may be at risk for behavioral disorders. Guthmann and Kolvitz recommend addressing the lack of evidence-based programs for this population, as well as shortages of accessible substance abuse and mental health programs nationally. They conclude the chapter by including additional recommendations, such as steps that could be used to build and implement accessible programming in prison for inmates.